Hello, and thank you so much for inviting me to the Lewinsky College for your annual conference. And the topic of parents is so crucially important and so often neglected. So thanks for putting this on the agenda. You know, I believe that one of the biggest issues in education that we face today is that the trend towards commodifying education. You know, we treat students as consumers of educational content, teachers as some kind of service providers, and then parents as customers and clients. And that has created a distance between the relevant players that actually is the source of so many issues and problems in education. How do we make education more of a whole of society enterprise? And of course we do that at very difficult times. At this moment, our eyes are still very much focused on the pandemic. Even, you know, if it's no longer a medical issue, it has disrupted our way of thinking and working in education so fundamentally. And one thing is for sure, you know, the future is always going to surprise us. Climate change is going to disrupt our lives a lot more than this pandemic. And artificial intelligence puts so much of what we do in education to the test. We know how to educate second-class robots, you know, people who are very good at repeating what we tell them. But what's going to make us human in a world in which the kind of things that are easy to teach and easy to test have also become easy to digitize, to automate, to outsource? So those are the questions we need to ask ourselves, and they are quite relevant questions in Israel too. You know, students in Israel on our PISA assessments are actually quite good when it comes to reproducing subject matter content. But they often struggle when they have to extrapolate from what they know, apply their knowledge in unfamiliar, novel situations. And this is what this world is there for. This work no longer rewards you just for what you know. Now Google knows everything. This world rewards you for what you can do with what you know. And there's so many other forces that shape the future and the future of education. Just think about our economies. If you look, actually, you know, the drivers of our economies, and nobody knows that better than you in Israel, are all about intangibles. Why are technology companies so successful these days? Not about tech. Tech is the method. No? It's because they're dealing with intangibles, with ideas, with knowledge. They connect knowledge and ideas. That is what powers today's economies. You look at traditional Fortune 500s, and yeah, they still exist, but they're no longer the engines of growth. No? What's behind that? You know, once again, the kind of things that are easy to teach and test, the routine cognitive skills are diminishing in importance. No? Technology-intensive skills are on the rise, and you put the two things together, and that's the future of work. No? Of course, there's a lot of debate around this. You know, some people say, well, you know, technology is going to destroy more jobs. Other people think it's going to create more jobs. There are many questions we cannot yet answer, but the direction of travel is so clear. Tomorrow's education really needs to educate young people in a very different way for a very different world, for, you know, jobs that have not been created, to use technologies that have not been invented to solve social problems we cannot yet imagine. And we're actually quite far away from that. You know, when we asked 15-year-olds in our PISA assessment, you can see here very clearly, you know, a third, sometimes, you know, close to 50% of young people aspire to the kind of jobs that are most at risk of automation. We know how to educate young people for our past, but not for their future. You know, more recently, we started to assess social emotional skills at the OECD. Unfortunately, I don't have data for Tel Aviv on this, but for some other world cities. And when we asked 15-year-olds and 10-year-olds question about creativity, we could see that in every city, 15-year-olds reported lower levels of creativity than 10-year-olds. Now, you know, developmental psychologists have some explanations for this. They say, well, if students, as they grow older, you know, they become more self-conscious, more self-critical, and therefore less creative. But surely there are other questions around this as well. We're all born with an abundance of creativity. You know, if you have a 3-year-old son or daughter, they're going to question everything you're going to tell them. They're going to experiment with anything that gets into their way. They're always willing to learn, always willing to unlearn, always willing to relearn when the world is changing. But then, you know, when they get older, we put them to our schools, we try to make them compliant with our ways of thinking, and we should be conscious that maybe, you know, that diminishes some of the energy they will need for the world of tomorrow. You know, the world of work is changing as well. Everywhere you can see that polarization. Those with the right skills never had the life chances they have today, but those who struggle with that transition into this new world, this new society, this new economy, they pay an increasingly steep price for this. And it's not just about economic participation, it's about social participation, about civic participation. Taking part in this world, an active part in this world. It's just, you know, harder and harder without the right knowledge, skills, attitudes, values. And then, you know, you might find it hard to believe, but we work less and less. We spend a bigger part of our lives, an increasing part of our lives, on other things. Are we preparing people for those other things, to live with themselves, to live with people who are different from them, to live with this planet? And I think these are really, really big questions we need to ask ourselves. And then, you know, of course, knowledge is always power. Look at the exponential rise of wikis. You know, in the year 2000, when we started with our PISA assessment, the world was very different. Most of the knowledge was communicated by very reliable sources. The television anchors, the newspaper editors. In school, you would read books that have been carefully created, authorized by governments. When you didn't know the answer to a question, you could look it up in an encyclopedia and you could trust the answer, you find that to be true. What an easy world. Today, you know, when you look for your answer on Google, you get 10,000 answers, 100,000 answers, and nobody is going to tell you what is right and what is wrong, what is true and what is not true. Literacy is no longer about extracting knowledge. It's about constructing knowledge, navigating ambiguity, reconciling tensions and dilemmas. Are we ready for that? Well, actually, if you look at the PISA results, on the left side you see a few countries. Now look at Singapore, Korea, parts of China, where you can say at least half or more of the population has those digital navigation skills. And with that I don't mean technological skills. I mean those conceptual, cognitive skills to distinguish fact from opinion, to navigate ambiguity, to integrate different information sources, precisely what you need to take part in the world. Israel is quite well positioned on this as well, but you can still see, you know, the majority of students at age 15 are not ready for the technological world in which they live. Being born into the digital world doesn't mean you're a digital native. I know you're going to tell me, well, you know, humans have always been better to invent new tools than to use them wisely. No. What's new in here? Point is that this is making a real difference for the lives of people. And then there is no planet B. Every one of us knows that we are living well beyond our means. You can see the gray line here, the dotted line showing what is sustainable, and you can see we live as if we had, you know, 1.7 planets around us now. That is the reality. Our lifestyles are totally unsustainable. If you're an American, you live as if there would be 5 planets. It will not work, and we are feeling the consequences every day. You ask school leaders, and they tell you, yeah, it's true, but we have built that into our school curriculum. 9 out of 10 school leaders in OECD countries, and Israel is no exception on that. You can see, say, yeah, climate change and global warming is something that we have, integrated in our formal school curriculum. By the way, also gender equality, conflicts, poverty, migration, or you name it. A lot of issues have been incorporated into the formal school curriculum. But you get a different perspective when you survey students about it, 8 out of 10 students tell you, yeah, looking after the global environment is really, really important to me. The climate agenda is important, is urgent for young people. But when you ask them, can you do something about this? No? Or do you think what you do is going to make a difference for people in other places? The bars get a lot shorter. And that really is the crux of education today. No? We've made young people passive consumers of prefabricated content. We do too little to help them build that agency, to mobilize their cognitive, social, and emotional resources. No? To build that co-agency. No? We never live alone. We live with other people. No? And that collective agency, that the whole becomes so much bigger than the sum of its parts. No? In the last PISA assessment, we looked at one facet of this, and this is what we call the growth mindset. No? On the right side, you see countries where students see the sky as the limit. No? They have that belief that they can grow beyond their limits, that if they invest effort, their teachers are going to help them, and they're going to be solving the most difficult issues. On the left side, you see countries where students mainly believe this is all a story about intelligence. If I'm not born intelligent enough, there's nothing I can do. So why should I study hard? No. On the vertical axis, you have the PISA performance, and you can suddenly see the two are closely related. Now you can see a country, like Estonia. Now you can see where students have that growth mindset and also excel academically. A country like Indonesia, where students struggle with math and science, and also they believe that, success is about the intelligence that we're born with. No? And Israel is exactly on that straight line too. No? It's not just about academic success, it's about the mindset that we develop. And, you might think PISA scores, are they so important? But, the issue goes well beyond it. You can see that students with a growth mindset were more motivated to master difficult tasks. They had a greater sense of self-efficacy. They were less afraid of failure. And once again, think about this, If you want your kids to be imaginative, creative, you have to give them space to experiment. If they, use that space, they're going to, take risks. If they take risks, they make mistakes. If we do not allow children to take that risk, to experiment, then, and to learn from and with mistakes, maybe they do not become so creative. No? So, long story. Why do I tell you this when we are talking about parents? Well, let's have a look. Let's start with the teacher dimension. We see, through our data, how important it is that schools become a whole of society enterprise. Let's, leave academic outcomes to the side and look at student well-being. When we survey 10-year-olds, actually, most of them are quite happy with their lives. Here you can see sort of a measure from the WHO that they use to measure psychological well-being, and you can see for 10-year-olds, most people say, my daily life is filled with things that interest me. I woke up fresh and rested. I felt active and vigorous. I felt calm and relaxed. I felt cheerful and in good spirits. For the majority of 10-year-olds, the world seems in order. But when you ask those same questions for 15-year-olds, you can see the bars get very quickly shorter. Now, it's not just a story about education. Now, developmental psychology, gives you plenty of answers to this. Adulthood is a very difficult period for students. But if it is, shouldn't we know more about it? Shouldn't we equip, teachers about it? Shouldn't we help, teachers to help parents deal with those issues at home, because if you don't, you're going to get them at the doorsteps of your school anyway. We ask ourselves, what are the important predictors for student well-being? Some people say that's all about, academic pressure, exams, making students' life a misery. Actually, there's no data to support it from the survey. Exams and assessment were not a driver of student, anxiety or negative well-being. The three most powerful predictors of student well-being, psychological well-being, were about students' stress resistance, students' sense of optimism, and the energy they felt. Now, where does that stress resistance, that optimism, that energy come from? And you as teachers will know, well, actually, the answer is not that difficult. The best predictors of the drivers of student well-being, stress resistance, optimism, energy, is the quality of student-teacher relationships. Where students feel, I have a teacher who knows who I am, who cares who I am, who knows who I want to become, who accompanies me on my journey, who invests energy in this relationship. You can see that, stress resistance, optimism, emotional control are better developed. And by the way, that is true for many other social emotional outcomes that we measured. The quality of student-teacher relationships, also was positively related to student responsibility, to their persistence, to their self-control, to their empathy, to their trust, to their cooperation, to their tolerance, to their curiosity, to their creativity, to the sociability they felt, assertiveness, energy, self-efficacy, achievement motivation. Suddenly you can see, that school is not a transactional business. It's a social, it's a relational enterprise. And education systems that give more space for that personal teacher-student interaction generally see more positive social emotional outcomes. And systems that see better social emotional outcomes, as you could see at the beginning, generally see better academic outcomes. We have industrialized education. We have tailorized it. We say, if you're a teacher, you're going to just teach 1 hour after the other. We have taken away that human, that relational kind of component. That's so different in some of the East Asian education systems, where you, as a teacher, teach less. If you're a teacher in Shanghai in China, you teach 11 to 16 hours per week. But you actually spend 50 hours in the school because you spend most of your time actually working with students on an individual basis, in small groups. You know their lives. You spend time with them just to understand them, to support them. And so importantly, to support their families, to engage with the parents. I was once in one of the poorest provinces in Yunnan, in China. And actually, I was very impressed, how teachers were working with parents and how parents were supporting school. And then, I asked a teacher, how do you achieve this? How do you get parents so interested, involved? And she said, well, I try to speak with every parent about twice per week. I call them, I visit them. And then I said, well, that must be incredibly demanding on your time. And she said, yeah, but, I never thought about it like this. If I wouldn't have all of these parents helping me, I couldn't possibly do my job. That's where you can see parents were not clients. They were actually, part of that ecosystem schooling. And that brings us to this question of parental support. Have a look at the data here. You can see actually, where school principals felt that teacher behavior was hindering learning. I compare Israel with the OECD average, and that may not be the truth. This is just what school principals tell us about teachers. You can see some principals felt teachers are not well prepared for their classes, and that's what's hindering learning. Or teachers are too strict with their students. Staff resisting change. 30% of principals believe, that's actually, hindering learning. Teachers not even being present, or teachers not meeting individual students' needs. In the eyes of principals, teacher behavior often stands in the way, and one can say in Israel even more so than on average across OECD countries. Does that matter? Well, actually, the data show, the same data from the same survey, show actually that teacher behavior, in ways that hinders learning in the eyes of school leaders is actually affecting reading performance on the PISA test. Now, you can see very clearly, as principals feel that, teachers are being too strict with their students, too rigid. You can see that is a depressor of learning outcomes. Now, the more that happens, you see lower performance outcomes across education systems now. Where principals feel teachers are not meeting individual student needs and that's hindering learning, you can actually see results are getting down. Now, or staff resisting change, teacher absenteeism, teachers not being well prepared for classes. Now. So those things do matter. Teacher behavior does matter. And nobody is to know that better than you. The Lewinski College is all about, preparing the next generation of teachers now. So what can we do about this now? Here's an interesting facet of this. Basically, where teachers were discussing the child's progress with parents, in most cases we observed, or school leaders observed less, of behavior that hinders learning. Now, you can see that here across countries. In most countries, the bars go down. That really shows actually the prevalence of that negative teacher behavior was much less pronounced when actually there was more of a culture of parent-teacher interaction around the individual child. So probably when parents and teachers were discussing the needs, the issues around an individual child, then, the teacher was maybe less strict because they understood better what was happening to the child. They took greater care of the individual needs of children. So you can see suddenly the parents get into this equation. It's very, very important sources of information and counterparts of teachers. Look at academic resilience, and that's something Israel generally struggles with now. How do students from disadvantaged backgrounds overcome their barriers and still succeed? That's what we call academic resilience. Now, you come from a disadvantaged family and you still make it. You still display good results. You overcome that kind of social context. In some countries, if you go here to Macau in China, 20% of the students from disadvantaged backgrounds still, master to get to the top of the national performance distribution. And many other systems actually do that quite well. What's the driver of that resilience? Of course, it has a lot to do with what you do as a teacher. I don't want to deny it, but look at the next chart. Actually, parental support was one of the biggest predictors of student resilience. Where basically, more academically resilient students were found among those who reported more parental support. And we ask students to what extent your parents are interested in what you do. That's about resilience. That's also about performance. The simple fact whether parents ask their children, how was school? And that's not about having an academic degree or spending 3 hours of homework with your child. It's simply showing your child that what you do in school matters to me. That simple question had greater influence on learning outcomes and parental income. And again, as teachers, you can foster that attitude, that environment, that attitude of respect. The parents respect the authority of the teacher has that authority. And that is something that we can create. Parent support, a driver of student resilience. So what do parents do? Here I compare Israel with the OECD average based on our PISA data, and you can see voluntary in physical and extracurricular activities, not so common, but actually Israel is doing better than the average across OECD countries. Now, participating in the local school government, basically, providing advice and guidance to schools, discussing their child's progress on the initiative and of one of their child's teachers. No? And that is very important. It's not, basically just the parent knocking on your doors. It's you taking that initiative as a teacher to build that dialogue, and not just, when there is a kind of problem. No? Because then the parents will get very defensive. But, build that regular dialogue. You can see actually many parents in Israel are doing that. No? But, couldn't be everyone. No? And then also discussing progress with a teacher on their own initiative. Now, that's the other part of that equation. So you can say actually Israel is at least doing as well as the average across OECD countries. Now, parental involvement in school activities really, really matters. Now, you can see very clearly, where parental involvement in school activities was stronger. You can see many of the outcomes become really, really positive. Of course, in some areas you see a negative relationship because sometimes, those parents you want to reach are not so much involved. That's also an important signal. How can you as a teacher, engage every parent? The parents you need to actually help students progress. And you can see this is very, very important. There is a huge gap in many countries in the discussion of progress of children between advantaged and disadvantaged schools. No? In a privileged neighborhood, everybody is doing that. It's a custom, that we basically engage with parents, no? Because parents expect it. Parents maybe are themselves more educated. In disadvantaged neighborhoods, that is often neglected. No? And that is true in most of the education systems for which you have data. No? That's really something we need to build more of that relationship and to focus our efforts on disadvantage. That's where you can make most of a difference. No? Bringing those parents on board. Of course, it's also harder. The parents may not come on their own initiative to schools. You may have to go to the parents' home or engage them personally. No? But the power of a phone call, don't underestimate it. It is something that some schools have done really successfully. And in some countries, it happens everywhere. You can see some countries where there is very, very little of a gap between disadvantaged and privileged schools. And you can see it's also a story of public and private schools. Generally, private schools do better. And even after discounting for social background. So this is not, again a story about social background, but often, private schools sometimes have more of a culture of seeing their parents as, important partners that need to sort of get support and engagement. And of course, we ask parents also, why don't you engage yourself in this? And the answers are very, very clear. I was not able to get off from work. No. But when you see that, couldn't make schools be more flexible, accommodate parents' work schedule? No. That's also important that schools are not just saying, I'm open on this hour and you have to come, but can we not better engage with this? No? The meeting times were inconvenient. That's the biggest barrier. No? I had no one to take care of my children. Of course, that's also an issue. I do not know how I could participate in school activities. Think about it. And that bar gets much, much longer when we come to disadvantaged children. No? Parents of disadvantaged children. Parents may want to get involved, but they simply do not know how to. Because schools often are not very, very good to communicate in the language of the parents. They communicate in their own kind of language that's sometimes hard to understand for parents. Well, there's a lot we can do to actually advance our education systems. And that brings me back to this topic of equity. How do we actually move from just, dealing with the parents and the students that are easy to deal with, and sort students towards helping every learner succeed? Understanding the extraordinary talents of ordinary students. Let me bring you back once more to the PISA league tables. Let's pick a country like the Slovak Republic. It's sort of an average performer. And here you can see the performance gap between the most disadvantaged and the wealthiest students. It covers the world. And if I would show you that for Israel, it doesn't look so different. You come from a poor background, you come out at the bottom of the scale. You come from a wealthy background, actually education actually gets you very far. And maybe, for privileged students, schools don't make that much of a difference. They would have succeeded anyway. Some people look at this and say, well, poverty is destiny. But actually, then you look at the 10% of the most disadvantaged students in Portugal. They have the same kind of social background as those in the Slovak Republic. You can see the disadvantaged students in Portugal do as well as the average student in the Slovak Republic. And the 10% most disadvantaged students in the Chinese regions compare with the wealthiest students in the Slovak Republic now. Because once again, they invest in the ecosystem in the school. They attract the most talented teachers to the most challenging classrooms, and they ensure that every parent, is becoming part of that ecosystem. You as a parent are responsible, and the school system will hold you responsible. They will actually, walk with you. If there's something, that your child needs to develop, they will call on you, and they will support you. They will give you that education that you need to educate your children now. And equity, of course, is not just a story of individual students. It's also a story of school performance. Now, this is sort of a picture that you've probably seen in one of the other forums. What you can really see is that, if you go to Finland, the school system is very even. The closest school is always the best school. There's virtually no variability in school performance. The education system is very, very open, very permeable. Very few disparities in school performance. Schools are very well connected. If you're a school leader in Finland, you'll spend 2/3 of your time in your school and 1/3 of your time in the local municipality, and you work with other principals now to solve the problems that confront your school. You know what other principals are doing. You're well connected. You're well embedded in the school system. You share your expertise, and therefore all schools succeed. No. Israel is exactly on the opposite side of the spectrum. Huge variability in the quality of schooling. No. And that makes the system actually so impermeable. No. You can see, on the left side in Finland, if you come from a disadvantaged background, you can make it into a high-performing school if you're really talented. If you are in Israel, actually, it's much, much harder to actually overcome that social disadvantage, to get into a really high-performing school as a bright student. So there you can see how parental background becomes a barrier that actually then operates for the students. And some of that has to do with the allocation of resources. Now you can really see very clearly is that in most countries like Israel are on the left side of the spectrum, in the red area, where actually if you come from a disadvantaged background, you also going to get the worse equipment and the lower qualified teachers. Now, that is unfortunately the reality. Our education systems are not very good in attracting the most talented teachers to the most challenging classrooms, to get the best principals into the toughest schools. We need to redouble our efforts to overcome that parental kind of background that stands in the way. And that also means, shifting from looking upwards in the education systems to shifting more towards looking outwards. Getting actually the system more open. Building more capacity at the front line. There's huge variability on this across countries. Now, when you look to the Netherlands, 8 out of 10 decisions are made at the front line. As a teacher, as a school leader, you have to work together to figure things out, because that's your role, that's your responsibility. If you are in Turkey or in Greece or in Switzerland, less than 1 in 10 decisions are made at the front line. And most decisions are made sort of, at a higher level of government, somewhere in the bureaucracy. These data are a little bit old now. And Israel has actually advanced. It has given schools and teachers more frontline responsibility. But still, more can be done, and it matters. We can see very clearly where teachers and school leaders are more of drivers in educational outcomes. You can see very clearly that learning outcomes tend to be better. Frontline capacity, frontline initiative. And we have seen that very clearly also during the pandemic, where teachers were creative designers of innovative learning environments, where they were not just good instructors, but great coaches, great mentors, great facilitators, great evaluators. They could reach their students even in the most difficult circumstances. Building that frontline capacity is going to be hugely important. Now, how do we move from a culture of, prescription, where we tell people exactly what to do and how to work, to a culture of genuine ownership of professional practice? Now, those are the challenges that we have to deal with if we want to educate learners for their future, not just our past. Now. So how do we build that whole of society environment now? Well, it starts with working harder on the question of what. Working with parents, with the environment, with the business sector together to think about how is the world changing. We can see so clearly that the kind of things that are easy to teach and easy to test just matter a lot less. Schools are so good to keep students inside and the rest of the world outside. Schools need to open their walls and make them more permeable. Draw on the rich resources of our communities. Give students higher aspirations. I worked with an organization, a charity in England called Education Employers. We saw that actually the aspirations of students were often framed so much by parental background. Students from disadvantaged families just didn't see, their possibilities. They only saw the jobs of, the father, the mother, environment, and they were often low-class jobs. So why should I study science if I have never met a scientist? We try to change this. We posted an advertisement. Basically, just everybody could say, who wants to donate 2 hours of their time every month to help children in primary school learn about their own job. Why primary school? Because the most important career decisions you do not make when you graduate. The most important career decisions in your life you make actually in your very first years of school. That's when you decide, am I going to invest myself in schooling? Is this relevant for me? Am I going to study hard? What are my favorite school subjects and so on? And we expected 500, maybe 1,000 volunteers. From the first round on, we got 43,000 volunteers. People who were ready, parents who were ready, to commit their time and energy to explain to children what their job is. And it changed the reality. It suddenly brought that real world into schools, and it made parents become protagonists, and it enhances social mobility. It got, the whole education to focus more on complex ways of thinking, complex ways of working now. How do we, shift from just sorting students now, where some students succeed, to getting everybody to succeed now? Just not accepting that parental background can be a barrier, but, overcoming this by building those interactions and aligning resources with needs. And of course, that requires a very different caliber of teachers, a very different teaching profession. But we don't tell people exactly what to do and how we want it done, by where we invest in a high-level professional knowledge workers. And I know that what the Lewinski College is all about. Investing in the profession, investing in professional ownership. And of course, knowledge workers don't like to work in factories. They want to work in flat, collegial, entrepreneurial environments. That's the kind of environment that we should be fostering. And of course, this is not easy. There's always going to be tensions and dilemmas. How do we modernize our education systems, ensuring that, progress is gradual, consistent, transparent, and at the same time cope with the kind of disruptions that we're seeing all around us now? How do we reconcile new goals with our current structures that we're not going to change quickly? No. How can we do new things in old structures now? How do we help students and teachers develop a globally oriented mindset while still ensuring that they remain rooted in their local traditions, in their local culture? That is very clear. If you take, the floor away under people, they're going to be building walls around them, however self-defeating that is. Helping, teachers and students build that floor and at the same time, overcome the walls. That's the role of our future education systems now. How do we innovate in this, very conservative social enterprise that we call education. And let's be clear, we as parents are often not part of the problem, not part of the solution. We get very anxious when children no longer learn what was important for us, or when they do learn things we no longer understand. And you as teachers are often more likely to teach how you were taught than how you were taught to teach. And let's face this, policymakers can lose an election over education when something goes wrong, but they're never going to win an election over education because it just takes so much time to translate good ideas into better practice. And that's why you as teachers need to help them, to support them, build that kind of foundation to take courageous initiative. It's not going to come top down. It will always come, mobilized by the professional. How do we reconcile the virtual world that we had to discover during the pandemic, sometimes by force, with the importance of that face-to-face reality? Remember that learning is not a transactional business. It's always a social and relational enterprise. The parents are a key ingredient of greater student resilience and actually also more positive teacher behavior. And finally, how do we strike that right balance between learning and education? Well, I know, you're going to struggle with those questions here at your annual conference. And, I wish I could have joined you in person. That was the original plan, but I was glad I could at least share some thoughts by you through this video. Thank you again.